Did you know that Manila was once a British colony? That the Philippines almost became the first, the oldest, and the longest British colony in Southeast Asia? But what exactly happened? Who stopped the British from conquering the Philippines? So today, let's talk about how the British stole the Philippines. Mabuhay or in Kapampangan luwid kayo. Welcome back to my channel. It's me, Kirby Araullo, your friendly Pinoy historian and culture bearer. And if you are new to my channel, in this channel, I make videos about our people's history, our people's culture, and everything in between. So don't forget to like, share this video, comment down below, and please subscribe. October 6, 2021 marks the 259 years since the sacking and the fall of Manila at the hands of the British, when the Spaniards surrendered the city during the 7 Years' War. So today's video will be part 1 of my 2-part series about the British invasion of the Philippines back in the late 1700s. Actually, I already made a video about this, a short video about this a few years ago. So this 2-part series will be more of an extended, updated, and expanded version of that video, with more details answering the questions that I got from you, my beloved viewers, subscribers, and patrons. And here in part 1, we'll talk more about your questions about the conflict itself and who fought the battles, who defended the Philippines against the British invasion. And then on part 2, we'll talk more about the impacts of this invasion and occupation to the people and the history of the Philippines. Like what happened after, how did it change the course of our history? And then we'll look into what many of you have been asking me over the years. What if the British never returned the Philippines to Spain? What would happen if the Philippines remained a British colony? So stay tuned for that and make sure to subscribe and don't forget to hit that bell icon so you don't miss out when my next video comes out. Now back to our topic. So first, let's start with some context. Let's start from the beginning. What led to the British invasion of the Philippines, to the British invasion of Manila? What was the 7 Years' War and why was the Philippines affected by it? So for those who may not know, the 7 Years' War is believed to be the world's first major global conflict before the World Wars. So between 1756 to 1763, European kingdoms were fighting each other for supremacy. So we have Britain, Prussia, and Portugal in alliance on one side against France, Spain, Russia, Austria, and others on the other side. And this all began in North America. So the French and the British had become major rivals in colonizing North America, in what are now Canada and the United States. And they began a land war in 1754. It was also known as the French and Indian War because it also involved the Native Americans on both sides. So both the French and the British wanted to dominate the fur trade and the waterways of the Ohio River Valley and the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Basically, the French trade activities were preventing the British from expanding their own colonies. And on top of this, there has been so many unresolved issues between the European powers after the War of Austrian Succession in 1740 to 1748. So in short, there was too much rivalries between the European crowns that led to multiple conflicts and complicated web of alliances. So basically, the smaller conflicts just got more complicated and bigger each day. And this war spilled all over the colonies, from Europe to the Caribbean and North America, all the way across the Pacific Ocean to the Philippines and Southeast Asia. All because of their fight for European supremacy, aka all because of their egos and greed. Innocent people, especially in the colonies, suffered terribly. So if you want to learn more about this complicated global conflict, check out the links below for more videos and resources. Pero wait lang, if the war was mainly in North America and Europe, then why did the British attack the Philippines? What was their reason? Manila during this time was a prosperous and flourishing global port city. It was made famous all over the world for its mythical opulence and the legendary galleon trade. In fact, the British pirates in the Caribbean got rich and famous partly because of the treasures from the Manila galleon trade, a global trade that connected Asia via Manila to the Americas via Mexico and ultimately to Europe and the rest of the world via Spain. Manila was also very close to China, to the markets of China, China, and this was also a huge factor. We have to remember that during this time in the 1700s, the British have not yet colonized Hong Kong or Singapore or Shanghai or Malaysia. In fact, the closest base or British stronghold from which the British left to attack Manila was actually all the way back in India. And the British had long wanted to have a piece of this legendary wealth and treasure. And because of the 7 Years' War, the British now had a reason to invade. And they had planned an invasion of Manila for many months. And Manila, although a very well-defended city, was actually an easy target, mostly because it was on the other side of the world and that the Spaniards were not expecting the British to attack Manila. The British naval forces finally entered Manila Bay on September 23, 1762, surprising the Spaniards and catching them off guard. They had no idea that the war in Europe and North America was on their way. And during this time, the Spanish colonial government in Manila was also in the middle of transition. So it wasn't easy for them to mount a formidable defense against this sudden attack. And so the outnumbered Spanish forces sought the help of thousands of native warriors to defend the islands. And thus, a ferocious battle ensued, starting on September 24 and lasting until October 6, 1762. It was recorded that the British Navy fired more than 5,000 bombs and more than 20,000 cannonballs towards the city of Manila. And this resulted in the unsurprising defeat of the ill-prepared Spaniards. The British captured Manila, then known as the greatest Spanish fortress in the Western Pacific. This also resulted in the sacking, looting, and pillaging of Manila, where houses were burned down, where people were massacred, tortured, or raped, and millions worth of treasures were either stolen or destroyed. And to add insult to injury, the British demanded a ransom of 4 million Mexican silver dollars to save what remains of the city and its people from being turned into ashes. And so, the Spanish colonial forces led by Simon de Anda retreated with the help of the Kapampangans, and they moved their colonial capital to the prestigious and wealthy town of Villa de Bacolor in Pampanga, where it remained until after the war. Now, for more details about the blow-by-blow accounts of these battles, check out the links below for more resources. So, if the Spaniards surrendered easily, then did the British successfully conquer the entire archipelago we now call the Philippines? Not really, just Manila and Cavite. The British also did not have enough forces to conquer the entire archipelago, so they decided to focus on capturing the fabled capital city of Manila first and the nearby provinces in Luzon. But their attempt to conquer Luzon was quickly stopped. The native auxiliary forces aided the Spaniards in successfully containing the British advancement. The combined forces of the Spaniards, Kapampangans, and other natives, numbering around 10,000 soldiers, encircled the city of Manila. They successfully cornered the British, therefore limiting their occupation to just the city of Manila itself and the neighboring towns in Cavite. And in the coming months, they successfully pushed back and forced the British to give up conquering the rest of Luzon and to just remain in the city of Manila. And so the British occupation of Manila and Cavite only lasted from 1762 to 1764. And during this time, the British took advantage of the proximity to trade with China. And the 7 Years' War ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in February of 1763. And when the news finally reached the Spaniards in the Philippines in August of 1763, they immediately informed the British about the treaty that required them to vacate Manila. But the British in Manila refused. They did not receive their own copies of the order until March of 1764, the following year, and they only returned the city of Manila and Cavite to the Spaniards later in 1764. It is also important to remember that during this time in the late 1700s, the Spaniards did not even have an effective control of the entire Philippines. The sultanates of Sulu, Maguindanao, and others remained independent from Spanish rule. In fact, even Bohol was actually independent during the time of the British invasion. The Boholanos were free from colonialism for about 2 decades when the British invaded Manila. So check out my video on Dagohoy and Bohol's successful 8-decade revolt against the Spaniards in the links below. So aside from the Spaniards and the British, who else were involved in these battles? Who actually fought in these battles? On the side of the invaders, we have at least 610 sepoys who were recorded to be part of the British expedition to invade Manila. Sepoys were the Indian infantry that the British East India Company recruited. Despite fighting under the British command, the sepoys also had to come up with their own provisions. In short, they need to find and fund their own supplies to survive. And this meant that they were highly dependent on the promises of payment for their services to the British. But sadly, the British actually failed to pay the sepoys for their bravery and service. And as a result, many sepoys deserted the British and they settled in what are now the towns and the cities of Cainta, Taytay, and Pasig and others. And to this day, many Filipinos can trace their ancestry back to the sepoys that the British had left behind. Apart from the sepoys, there was also an undefined, unclear numbers of Lascars who were also part of the British expedition. Lascars were Indian sailors who were mostly from Bengal, Assam, and Gujarat, and they specialized in skilled but menial labor, and they too were not paid enough by the British. They only earned half of what others would earn from doing the same job. In short, just like the sepoys, the Lascars were also exploited and used as dispensable bodies to feed the growing British Empire. It is also worth noting that the Chinese of Manila and Pampanga also rose up in support of the British. But more about this on the second part of this video, so stay tuned. Now on the side defending the Philippines, we have about 10,000 native warriors who were vastly made up of Kapampangans. And as mentioned before, the Kapampangan warriors made up the vast majority of the so-called Spanish forces in the Philippines. These native auxiliary forces who successfully defended Luzon from the British were mostly recruited from the provinces of Tondo, or what is now Metro Manila, and the provinces of Bulacan and Pampanga. Some were also recruited from Batangas, Laguna, and Pangasinan. But unknown to many Filipinos today, according to both historical records and oral traditions, the vast and densely populated regions from the banks of the Pasig River in Tondo all the way up to pretty much most of the fertile plains of central Luzon were once predominantly Kapampangan. These were once the ancestral homeland of the Kapampangan-speaking people. And there is actually a correlation or a connection between the British invasion of the Philippines and how Bulacan today is no longer Kapampangan but ending up predominantly Tagalog. But more on this in part 2, so stay tuned. And yes, Tagalog and Pangasinense warriors also fought in these battles against the British, but the vast majority were recorded to be Kapampangans. Hence why the colonial capital was moved to Pampanga, because it was more secured and strategic. It just sucks that oftentimes the contributions and the heroism of our diverse ancestors are often minimized or even erased in the dominant portrayal of our own history. And in this channel, my goal is to highlight the forgotten parts of our own histories. You know, the parts that are often ignored or simply not mentioned in the mainstream narrative of the histories of the Philippines and Southeast Asia. And these are based on my own research as a historian and a culture bearer who is determined to dig deeper beyond the colonial miseducation of our people and beyond what has been taught to us in schools. And it is also important to note that apart from the Tagalogs, Pangasinenses, and Kapampangans, the Ilocanos also offered to help to fight against the British, but they were rejected by the Spaniards. And this eventually led to one of the most historic revolts in Philippine history. But more on this later in part 2. But now, let's talk about why did the Kapampangans and other native forces sided with the Spaniards? Why would they sacrifice their own lives to defend their cruel colonial masters? Now this is complicated and can get controversial given the present-day stereotypes and misunderstandings. But one, it is very important for us to remember that the concept of the Philippines as a united nation state with one united identity and the Filipino patriotism we know today did not yet exist. Not until the revolutions in the late 19th century. And because the Philippines was very far from Spain and the Americas, the Spaniards depended heavily on our our local forces to defend our islands. And they also relied on pitting our diverse people against one another to prevent us from uniting. It is a common tactic for colonial empires to keep people of color divided in order to perpetuate their dominance over the colony, in order to keep their power over our people. But more importantly, especially in this case, the British were still foreigners in the eyes of our ancestors. They were seen as the evil foreign invaders here to invade, pillage, and terrorize the people. And not just the Spaniards, but also the natives of the Philippines. In fact, the British even used the sepoys to resemble the Muslim raiders to terrorize the coastal towns of Luzon. And the natives, our ancestors, our people, were terrified of being captured by the sepoys or the British. They were afraid to be sold into slavery. We must also remember that the British were not invading to free us from the Spaniards. They also desired the wealth of our ancestors and the abundant resources of our islands, not for our own benefit, but to enrich themselves. In other words, they were there because they wanted their own piece of the pie and not to liberate us. Another crucial factor was that, for better or worse, the people of colonial Philippines had by then, in the late 1700s, been Catholics for at least 200 years. And as Catholics, they saw the British as heretics, as an enemy of the Roman Catholic Church. So the issue here was not just about betraying their fellow Filipinos by choosing the side of the Spanish colonizers, but rather making the hard decision of choosing the lesser evil among the Europeans. And in their eyes back then, these were the Spaniards. And the Spanish colonizers took advantage of this fear-mongering to keep the native forces of the Philippines on their side. The Spaniards also promised to give benefits to those who will fight under their banner. So this was less of a treachery or betrayal, but more about choosing the best option available to our ancestors at the time. They did what they had to do to defend their homes, to defend our motherland and our people from the invaders. And again, this was not the first time that the Spaniards took advantage of this. It happened before, for example, in the wars against the Dutch in the 1600s, or against the many Asian pirates who tried to invade the Philippines between the 1500s to the 1600s, and even against the Muslim forces of the Sultanates of Sulu and Mindanao. The Spaniards relied heavily on this fear-mongering and divide-and-conquer tactics to keep themselves in power. It is also worth remembering that the native auxiliary forces, like the Kapampangans, were not always blinded by their service to the Spaniards. Their primary loyalty was still to their people, our people. There were many instances when they also rose up against Spanish abuses and exploitation, but more on this in future videos. And as you can see, history is not black and white, or simply us versus them, the good versus the evil. It was never that simple. So we always have to dig deeper beyond what we see in the textbooks, beyond the dominant narrative of our people's history. Because for the last 500 years, our history was written from the perspectives of the Westerners, of the invaders, of the colonizers. So always remember to also look at our histories from the perspectives of our own people, to learn from the experiences and from the mistakes and the wisdoms of our ancestors. And that is it for me today, so stay tuned for part 2 of this video. We'll be talking more about the impact of this invasion to our people and to the history of our islands. We'll also go over the revolts in Ilocos, Cagayan, Pampanga, and others, and even what was going on in the Visayas, in Sulu, and Mindanao. So stay tuned. And then at the end of that video on part 2, we'll also be answering the question that many of you have asked. What if the Philippines remained a British colony? What would happen to us today? So don't miss out! And if you like this video and learned a thing or two, don't forget to like, share this video, comment down below, and please subscribe! But of course, before we go, today's shoutout goes to Rafael Agipo from Pampanga, Charity Cruz from Toronto, Canada, Takyudin Wahab from Malaysia, and Max Reaction from the US. Actually, thanks to Max Reaction for reacting to my old video about this topic. And special shoutout to my longtime patron Billy Price. Dakalpong salamat for all your love and support. And of course, special thanks to all my patrons for all your love and support in helping me make more videos like this through the years. Maraming salamat po. Dakalpong salamat, dagang salamat, magsukol, agyamanak, terima kasih. So for those who want to help me make more videos like this, show your support and please please be my patron or get a copy of any of my books or coloring books or any of the merch link down below. And again, maraming salamat po. Daghang salamat, magsukol dakalpong salamat. See you next time, or in Tagalog, kita kits, and in Kapampangan, Mikitix!